There was a young woman who walked into a feed and grain depot on a Thursday morning in late November, with $6 in her coat pocket and two small children pressed close to her sides, and she walked out with 400 pounds of cracked. What happened between that Thursday and Christmas Eve would change 3 lives, and quietly, without anyone quite deciding it, a 4th. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? She was called Marin, 26 years old, green-skinned in the way that her people had always been green-skinned, which was to say entirely, from the knuckle creases of her large hands to the soft skin below her jaw, and she had grown accustomed over those 26 years to the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when she entered it. Not the silence of welcome. The other kind. The kind that has edges. She had 2 children with her that morning, Pip, who was 7, and watched everything with the careful, cataloging eyes of a child who has learned that adults change without warning, and Bryn, who was 4, and knew nothing of watchfulness yet, who said pecan and then said it again, because she liked the sound. The children were hers in every way that mattered, which is to say she had carried them through the last difficult year. The depot smelled of sawdust and oil, and something sweet beneath both, the faint ghost of the nut harvest that had come and gone. A man named Derwin stood behind the counter. He was not unkind exactly. He was the particular kind of unhelpful that presents itself as helpfulness, all slow head-shaking and the drawing of breath through teeth. He had 400 pounds of frost-cracked pecans in the back storeroom, damaged in the early freeze, unsellable as whole product, taking up space he needed by December 1st. $6 was what he'd take for the lot, and he'd throw in 3 burlap sacks to carry them, and the 3 burlap sacks were clearly where he felt he was being generous. Marin counted the money twice. She had counted it twice at home, too, but she counted it again because that is what you do when $6 is the number between you and the next possibility. She put it on the counter. Derwin took it. The transaction lasted less than 4 minutes and felt longer from her side of the counter than from his. She loaded the sacks herself, 2 trips through a side door and around the building, to where she had left the small cart she'd borrowed from the room she was renting at the edge of town. Pip helped drag the 3rd sack with both hands and his whole back in it, not complaining, and Bryn supervised by pointing and saying heavy each time, which was accurate. It was just past 8 in the morning. The sky was the flat white of a sky that has already delivered its opinion of the season and has nothing further to add. The room she rented was on the ground floor of a building owned by a widow named Osla, who had no patience for nonsense and a great deal of patience for people, which is not the same thing and is rarer. Osla had seen Marin arrive 6 weeks earlier with the 2 children and a single trunk, and the particular posture of someone who has recently stopped flinching and has not yet learned what to do with the stillness. She had given her the room for a price that was fair and not pitying, which Marin had recognized and been grateful for in a way she did not express directly, but expressed by paying on time every week without exception, leaving the shared areas cleaner than she found them, and never asking for anything she could manage without. The children slept on a pallet. Marin slept on the room's narrow bed, and woke before them each morning to think through the arithmetic of her situation. The arithmetic was not good. She had arrived in this town, Holwell, 6 weeks ago with $14, the conviction that she could make $14 into more before it ran out. She had made it into 8 through careful spending, and 8 had become 6, and 6 had now become 400 pounds of frost-damaged pecans and 3 burlap sacks that smelled of grain dust. The thing she had not told Osla, not told anyone in Hallwell, was that she could make pralines. It sounds a small thing. Her grandmother had taught her when she was 9 years old, standing over an iron pot in a kitchen that no longer existed, and the teaching had been less instruction than transmission, the way certain knowledge passes between people who share blood and time. There was a moment in the making of pralines when the sugar and the cream and the broken nut meat came together into something that was not quite liquid and not quite solid, and that moment lasted less than 30 seconds. Her grandmother had told her that was a gift. She had not entirely believed her until she was older, and had watched other people miss that moment and ruin a whole batch by missing it. She had no iron pot. She had the landlady's kitchen, which she had not asked to use. She knocked on Osla's door that evening, after the children were settled. Osla opened it and looked at her. "You need the kitchen," Osla said. Marin blinked. "How did you know?" "Because you bought Derwin's wreck of a pecan lot this morning and you've been quiet all day, which means you're thinking, and the only thing those pecans lead to is a kitchen." She opened the door wider. "We'll talk about what I get out of it." What Osla got out of it was 15% of whatever Marin cleared, access to as many pralines as she wished to eat herself, the right to stop the arrangement at any point if the kitchen was left in worse condition than she found it. Marin agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation, which Osla noted. "You're used to worse terms than that," Osla said. "Yes," Marin said. It was the most she said about it that night. She began the next morning. The first batch she made was a test batch. 2 pounds of the cracked pecans run through a cloth to separate the good meat from the frost-blackened pieces, the good meat roughly broken by hand, then brought together with brown sugar and heavy cream and a careful measure of butter over the wood stove. Osla sat at the kitchen table and watched, without commenting. Bryn sat beside Osla and also watched and also did not comment for approximately 4 minutes, then said, "It smells like the good kind of warm," which was accurate and which Osla repeated later to 3 different people, as though she had thought of it herself, which Marin did not mind. The first pralines cooled on a sheet of waxed paper on the kitchen table. They were irregular in shape, the way real pralines are, rounded and rough-edged and the color of dark honey. Osla took one and ate it entirely before saying anything. Then she said, "You can have the kitchen." This was already agreed. What she meant was something larger, which she did not say directly, and which Marin understood anyway. The question was, where to sell them? Marin was new to Hallwell, and she was an orc woman with 2 small children and very little social capital in a town where her people were regarded, in the main, with the particular unease that communities develop toward anyone they have decided in advance they do not need to understand. This was not universal. Osla had not felt it. There were others. But it was common enough to be a practical obstacle, not merely an emotional one. She walked the market street the following Saturday with a small wooden tray she had borrowed from Osla, 12 pralines on it, arranged in 2 rows, and offered samples. The first 3 people she approached declined without tasting. The 4th was a young woman about her own age who took a piece and chewed it and stopped walking and said, "Where did you learn to make these?" And Marin said, "My grandmother." Her name was Tally. She ran the small apothecary on the corner of the market road, and she had opinions about most things and expressed them at a pace that Marin, who spoke thoughtfully and not quickly, sometimes found. By the end of that first Saturday, Tally had told 17 people about the Pralines, using language Marin would not have chosen for herself, but which was effective. And Marin had sold 31 pieces at a price she had set after working out her costs twice on a scrap of paper that morning. She was selling at 4 copper pieces for 2 pralines, her cost per pair, accounting for the discounted pecans, the sugar, the cream, the fuel for the stove, and Osla's 15%, came to just under 1 copper piece. This meant that 31 pieces cleared roughly 13 copper, which was not yet meaningful, but was directional. She went home and cracked more pecan, and did not sleep well because she was calculating. Pip found her at the kitchen table near midnight, a lamp lit, the paper in front of her covered in numbers. He sat down across from her without asking. "Are we staying here?" he said. "I think so," she said. "I'm working on that," she said, and he looked at the paper and seemed to accept it as evidence. Over the following 3 weeks, Marin made pralines every morning from 6 until 9, while the children slept. And on weekdays, Tally sold them from a small basket she kept beside her apothecary counter as a favor that was gradually becoming a commercial arrangement. On Saturdays, Marin sold them herself at the market. By the second Saturday, she had a returning customer. By the third, she had 7. By the end of the 3rd week, she had cracked and processed 60 of her 400 pounds and cleared just over 4 gold pieces net, which was more money than she had held in one place in 18 months. She paid Osla a month ahead on the room. Osla took the money and told her to buy Pip a proper winter coat, which he needed, and Marin had already known he needed it, and had not yet found the gap in the arithmetic to address it. She bought the coat the next day. It was dark green and fit him almost perfectly. He wore it home and kept his hands in the pockets and said, "It's warm," the careful understatement of a 7-year-old who has learned not to want things too much. It was around this time that Sealstone Wright came into Tally's apothecary for a headache tincture and was sold 2 pralines alongside it, on the grounds, Tally told him, that one cured the physical pain. He was not the kind of man who was normally moved by this sort of pitch. He bought the pralines because arguing with Tally was slower than complying, which was a calculation many people in Holwell had arrived at independently. He was 39 years old and had been running his family's cooperage alone for 4 years, since his wife Fen had died of a lung fever in the winter of her 35th year. He was a large, quiet man made of work. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent 2 decades shaping wood, wide-palmed and calloused, with the particular permanent grain shadow that came from years of sawdust. He lived above the cooperage in rooms that were clean and orderly in the way of someone who tidies as a substitute for other things. Fenn's work-basket still sat on the windowsill in the front room, because he had not yet been able to decide where else to put it, and in 4 years he had not decided. The work-basket sat in the morning light every day, and he no longer saw it the way you stop seeing the things that are always there, except some mornings when he saw it very clearly. He ate the pralines on the walk home from the apothecary, and stopped in the middle of the street for a moment. Then he walked back and asked Tally where they came from. He appeared at the market the following Saturday. He was not a man who drew attention through any effort of his own, but he was a large man, and people noticed him, and people noticed where he stopped. And where he stopped was at Marin's table, and he bought a bag of 8 and paid without bargaining. He said they were the best thing he'd eaten since autumn. She said thank you. He nodded once and left. It was a 20-second conversation, and it was witnessed by several people and discussed for longer than 20 seconds in several kitchens that evening. She noticed him because she noticed everyone. Because she had spent years learning to read exits, to read moods, to read the difference between a man who was thinking and a man who was preparing. She read him as a man who was thinking, which was unusual, and she filed it and said nothing and sold the rest of her Saturday supply by noon. He came back the following Wednesday at mid-morning, not on market day, and found Tally's apothecary and asked if there were any pralines. There were not. He asked when there might be. Tally said she could find out. He left his name and where he could be found, which was unnecessary as everyone in Holwell knew Kyle Stonewright's cooperage on the south end of the market road, but he said it anyway with the careful courtesy of a man who does not assume. Tally appeared at Ursula's door within the hour and told Marin everything at speed and with a good deal of editorial commentary that Marin listened to patiently and largely discarded. What remained after the commentary was that a man who was known in town and seemed to be respected had asked specifically for her product on a non-market day. She sent 6 pralines to the cooperage via Bryn and Ursula, who made an adventure of the delivery. Bryn reported back that the man's workshop smelled like wood shavings, and that he had said, "Thank you," very properly, and given her a small carved bird that fit in her palm, which she showed to Marin with the gravity of a formal diplomatic exchange. Marin held the carved bird for a moment. It was a simple thing, a river finch, made in maybe 10 minutes by someone who knew wood, but made carefully. The feathers suggested, rather than carved in full detail, the weight distributed so it balanced on one finger. She set it on the windowsill beside the children's pallet and thought about it for longer than she would have admitted. The following week, with Tally's characteristic force of nature, an arrangement was proposed. Marin would supply the apothecary with a standing order of 4 dozen pralines per week to be sold at the counter, and Tally would take 12%, which was less than Ursula's arrangement but also did not involve access to a kitchen. So the comparison was imperfect. Marin agreed. She also separately began sending a small additional bag to the cooperage each week, which she priced and packaged the same as any other order, and left with Ursula for collection, and which she told herself was simply good business and expanding her customer base. Stonewright paid promptly every week. Twice he sent a brief note with the payment. The first said, "The dark ones with the salt are better." She had been experimenting with a light touch of sea salt over the finished pralines. The observation was technically correct and told her he was paying attention, which she noted. The second note, 3 weeks later, said, "The children are welcome at the cooperage if they want to see how a barrel is made." This sentence she read twice and then placed under a cup on the table, and looked at it again an hour later. She did not respond immediately. This was not rudeness. It was her established pace, the way she moved through decisions that had any weight to them, carefully and without rushing. Pip, who she had told about the invitation while trying to gauge her own reaction through his, said, "I'd like to see that," in a tone of great control that meant he would very much like to see it. Bryn said, Yes, barrels, with no ambiguity whatsoever. They went on a Thursday afternoon, Marin and both children. Gale showed them the cooperage without performance, which is to say he worked while he explained, bending staves over heat, driving hoops with a mallet, the whole place smelling of toasted oak and iron and linseed oil. Pip stood at a careful distance for 12 minutes, and then moved closer because he could not help it. Bryn moved close immediately, and was given a short, safe task of holding a small hoop steady, which she accomplished with enormous seriousness. Marin stood near the doorway and watched all three of them, and something in her chest did the thing that it did sometimes, the thing she did not yet have language for, that was neither grief nor hope, but contained some of each. Keel made tea afterward in the room above the cooperage. The room was plain and orderly, and the work-basket sat on the window-sill in the late afternoon light, and Marin saw it and looked away and looked back, and said nothing. He set cups in front of the children, and a larger cup in front of Marin, and sat down across the work-table from her. They drank tea. The children were unusually, mostly quiet, as though they understood that the room required a different register. He said, "How long are you planning to stay?" "In Holwell," she said. "That depends on a few things." He said, "What things?" She did not answer at once. The things were numerous and not simple, and she was not in the habit of offering them to people she had known for 6 weeks, even people who had sent polite notes and carved small birds from scrap wood. But she looked at him across the table, and she made one of her careful decisions, which was to offer one thing, one real thing, and see what he did with it. She said, "It depends partly on whether we're welcome here. Actually welcome, not just allowed." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You're welcome. In this room." It was a small thing, he said. It was a plain thing. It was the truth, and not more than the truth, and she had spent enough time around performed generosity to know the difference by its texture. She looked down at her cup. She said thank you, in a voice that was level and that cost her something. She would remember that sentence for a long time in this room, as though he was being precise about what he could honestly promise, and promising only that. December arrived. The praline business was, by this point, a real thing, with real numbers. She was moving through 60 to 70 pounds of pecans per week, depending on the batches, and she had refined the recipe through roughly 40 iterations, which is to say she had adjusted the sugar ratio 3 times, the cream content twice, had tested a batch with a measure of cane molasses alongside the brown sugar, and kept it, had arrived at the sea salt finish as a permanent feature after Kale's note. Her weekly net after all costs and tallies and Osla's percentages was running between 6 and 8 gold pieces. She had, as of the first week of December, accumulated 22 gold pieces in total, which was more money than she had seen in 2 consecutive years of the life she had come from. She was beginning to think about spring. She was beginning to think about the following year's nut harvest, which would not be frost-damaged, which would cost more per pound but yield better product. She was beginning to think in the language of next, which was new, and which she did not fully trust yet, but which she practiced anyway, the way you practice walking on a healing ankle, carefully, with attention paid to where it holds and where it doesn't. It was Tally who told her. She came to Osla's door on a Thursday morning, 8 days before Christmas, and her face was a specific kind of serious that Maren had not seen on her before, which was attention without commentary. She said, "Man came into the apothecary yesterday, asking about you. Not about the Pralines. About you. His name was Gareth Hollowtide, 32 years old. He had been for the 3 years before Maren left with the children, her husband. He had a way of entering a room that filled it with his particular version of correctness, a pressed collar, a composed expression, a voice that never rose above conversational. He had been searching for her for 6 weeks, which meant he had started within days of her leaving, which meant things Maren did not need to reconstruct. She sat down when Tally told her. She sat down at Osla's kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed through her nose for 12 seconds, which she counted. "Does he know where I'm staying?" she said. "Not for me," Tally said. "Not from anyone I know of." But Holwell isn't large. Osla, who had been in the kitchen and had heard, put a cup of something hot in front of Maren and said nothing. The cup was there. That was the gesture. Maren said, "He'll say they are his children." Tally said, "Are they? They are mine," Maren said. "I have been every part of their lives. He has been the part that made the other parts harder." There was a silence. Then Tally said, right, in a tone that closed the question, "He appeared 2 days later. A Saturday, which was market day, which meant witnesses, which was either an accident or a calculation, and knowing Gareth Hollowtide, Maren believed it was a calculation. He was well dressed for market day in a town he had never visited, which was itself a performance. He walked through the market with the purposeful ease of a man who is used to being seen as reasonable in public. And he came to Maren's table, and he stood across from her with the 2 children visible. Pitt gone absolutely still in the way he went, still when the world asked him to be smaller, Bryn not yet understanding. He said, "Maren, thank goodness we've been so worried. We—" The first word after her name was "we," which meant the audience, which meant whoever was near enough to hear him establish that there was a family, a worried family, a family that had been incomplete. This was not passivity. This was refusal, he said, still at a conversational volume that carried, "I've come to take you home. The children need their proper home. I'm sure this has all been very difficult." Pip's hand found Maren's arm. She put her hand over his. She kept her eyes on Gareth. She said, "We are home." He smiled the way he smiled when he was not pleased but had decided that displeasure was a card to play later. He said, "We should talk privately. You've made your point. Everyone can see you're capable and independent. I've never doubted that." And he kept going because he always kept going. The words themselves were part of it, the unrelenting surface of his reasonableness that left no gap for her to stand in, and she had spent 3 years inside that surface, with no gaps, and she knew exactly what it felt like. And she felt it now like a sound she had learned to recognize in the dark. Kyle Stonewright appeared at the edge of the market table. He had not pushed through. He had simply arrived, standing to the side, and he was large and quiet, and he was there. He did not speak. He did not move toward Gareth. He was simply present in the way of someone who has decided where he is standing and intends to remain. Tally appeared from the other side with a man Maren did not know but who Tally had later explained was the town notary, a compact, careful man named Saturn, who had a ledger under his arm and the composed expression of someone who takes notes and draws legal conclusions. Gareth glanced at Cale, and then at Saturn, and then back at Marin, and the warmth of his public performance shifted temperature by a fraction that only someone who knew him well would catch. "This isn't necessary," he said. "Lower now." "I'd like you to state clearly," Marin said, and her voice was steady. It was the steadiest her voice had been in years. "In front of these people, that you believe you have a legal claim to these children." "I am their father. You are not," she said. "Their mother asked me to care for them before she died. I have their care letters. I have the village midwife's testimony in writing. You married me after she was gone, and you used their names in the same sentence as your property for 3 years, and that is the full extent of your claim." She reached under the market table and took out a folded envelope and put it on the table in front of the Pralines, between herself and Gareth, in front of everyone. It had been there all morning. She had put it there before she opened the stall, because she had known he would come to the market, and she had prepared for this the way she prepared for the sugar moment in the Pralines, by understanding when it was coming and being ready for it before it arrived. Saturn the notary moved closer without being asked, and looked at the documents in the envelope with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has been briefed, which Tally had done the previous evening in a conversation that had run 2 hours. Gareth said several more things. He said them with decreasing composure and increasing volume, and each increase in volume was a further argument against him to everyone watching, because the man who has the better case does not need to get louder, and the people of Holwell, whatever their other limitations, knew that much. He spoke about his standing. He spoke about what was right. He spoke about what she owed him. Marin let him speak. She looked at him without expression and let him speak until the words ran out. She said, "I know you believe you are owed things. I believed that too. For a while I believed it because you told me so, over and over for 3 years, and some of it took root. But I came here and I worked, and I built something from $6 and 400 pounds of cracked nuts and a borrowed kitchen, and I did it while keeping 2 children fed and warm and safe, and I have done it without you, and I intend to keep doing it without you, and I am asking you now, plainly and in front of all of these people, to leave." She looked at him the way she had looked at him every day for 3 years, for much closer than this, and had not been able to look, because the distance between them then had not been physical and could not be measured in feet. Now there was a market table between them and a notary, with documents, and a quiet large man standing to one side, and a woman who sold apothecary goods and talked at speed and meant every word of it, and the distance was measurable. Gareth Hollowtide left. He left the way men leave when they have calculated that staying will cost more than going, not with dignity exactly, not with honesty, but without looking back, which was perhaps the one honest gesture he had made in the whole encounter, because looking back would have cost him something, and he had never been inclined toward expenditure of that kind. Several people in the market turned back to their business. Several did not, and watched Marin for a moment, and one woman, Marin did not know, nodded once at her from across the stalls, a small, specific nod that meant something, and that Marin received. He exhaled, and the exhale was so long and so complete that it was clear he had been holding it for longer than this morning, longer than this week, holding it in the specific way of a 7-year-old who has taken on the wrong portion of adult weight. Marin crouched beside him, right there at the market stall, and put both hands on his shoulders. She said, "You can breathe." "Now," he said, "I know," but he said it like he was still deciding whether to believe it. Bryn said, "Can we have a praline without any understanding of the preceding minutes?" Which was perfect, and which made Marin laugh, a real laugh, the first real laugh she'd had in a while, sudden and genuine. And she gave Bryn a praline and gave Pip one, and stood back up and sold the rest of her stock by mid-morning, packed the empty tray and the empty bags, and walked home with the two children beside her in the cold December light. The week before Christmas she had a visitor at Olsla's door. Cale stood on the step with his cap in his hands, which was a thing she had not seen him do before, and he was wearing his good coat, which she knew was his good coat, by comparison with the worn one he wore to the cooperage. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like to ask it plainly." She said, "All right." He said, "I'm not asking you to need me. I can see plainly that you don't need anyone. I'm asking whether you'd consider wanting company, specifically mine, on an ongoing basis." He paused. "I have a building with a good stove and more room than one person requires, and I've been alone in it for 4 years, and I've become accustomed to that. But I don't think I prefer it. And the children would be welcome, entirely welcome, in every room. I want to be clear about that part." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air was still between them. Inside, she could hear Bryn narrating something to herself, and the scratch of Pip's pen on paper, and somewhere behind all of it, the low hum of Olsla moving through the kitchen. She thought about what her grandmother had told her, that there was a moment in the making of something good, when everything comes together and you have to be ready for it. And the people who ruin it are the ones who hesitate past the moment because they're afraid of getting burned, and the getting burned is real. But the moment is also real, and it is brief, and it is only ever now, she said. "Ask me at Christmas. Ask me in front of the children." He said, "All right." He put his cap back on. He turned to go, and then turned back. He said, "For what it's worth, I've been a different kind of person since September. I think you should know that." He left. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the cold and watched the street and thought about growth. She thought about how things that grow beside old roots do not displace them. They grow alongside, the way new wood forms beside old wood in a living tree, each ring distinct, each one. She thought, a life does not have to forget what shaped it in order to grow past it. She thought, a heart makes room. Christmas morning arrived on a Thursday. The cooperage smelled of beeswax and toasted wood, the pralines that Marin had made the day before, and brought in a large tin, 2 full batches, 140 pieces. She had used the last of the frost-cracked pecans, and they had yielded everything she asked of them, right to the end. Ursula was there. Tally was there, which meant the room was louder and warmer by an automatic 10 degrees. Sarin the notary was there because Tally had invited him, and he had apparently been unable to find a reason not to come, which suggested he had not tried very hard. 3 of the neighbors who had nodded or turned away and then gradually turned back were there, filling the wide workroom with the slightly self-conscious warmth of people who are not sure they deserve to be celebrating but are trying. Pip sat on a barrel that Cale had smoothed, and capped specifically for sitting on, and ate a praline with the focused reverence of a boy who has decided to enjoy things. Bryn was everywhere. Keel stood beside Maren near the workroom window, and he asked her. He asked plainly and briefly, as was his way. He asked in front of the children as she had specified. Pip looked up from the barrel with an expression of studied calm that did not conceal how much he cared about the answer. Bryn stopped moving, which was a thing she almost never did, and looked at the two adults with her whole 4-year-old attention. Maren said, yes, not quickly, not shyly. She said it, the way she had done everything in the past 6 weeks, having thought it through completely, having calculated the costs and the possibilities, having decided that the moment was real and that the fear of being burned was real and that she was choosing the moment anyway. Teal put his hand over hers on the windowsill, his calloused cooperage hand over her large green hand, and the morning light came through the window and fell across both of them and across Fenn's work-basket, which had moved here from the room upstairs, not put away, not forgotten, but given a new position in better light, because that was how he had decided to hold it, with care and without freezing, as a true record of a year that had happened and mattered, and was not required to be the last word. Bryn immediately asked if being yes meant more pralines and was told yes, it meant exactly that, and she accepted this as complete information. Pip said, "Will we live here?" Cale said. Pip was quiet for 7 seconds, which Maren counted. Then he said, "The workshop smells like something good." It was the most he would say about it directly for months, and it was enough. And Maren knew it was enough, because she knew him, because she had carried him through the hard year and would carry him further, and the further now had a different shape than it had had in November, wider and less bare, with more people in it than she had thought to find when she left with $6 in her coat pocket and 2 children at her side. The pralines were gone before noon. Outside, the winter sky had opened unexpectedly into thin blue, pale and clean, the kind that arrives without warning, after a long stretch of flat white, and asks nothing of you except that you notice it. She stood at the cooperage door for a moment with the empty tin in her hands, the cold on her face, and the sound of people she knew now behind her, and she thought of the 400 pounds she had started with, the cracked and damaged and frost-ruined things that no one else had wanted, and what they had made. Some things become most useful after breaking, she thought. Some harvests wait until winter to matter. That was what she carried with her into the new year. Not a forgetting of what had cracked her, but the understanding that the cracking had also opened her, and that what grew in the opening was real, and hers, and warm, and had at last enough room.